At my wife's company dinner, my wife's coworker was laughing. How does it feel to be a loser? Your wife is the breadwinner of your home. Everyone laughed, including my wife, except me. I just smiled and asked the CEO, how does it feel to know that this loser owns 90% share of your company? The moment I said those words, his face turned pale. You know that feeling when you're standing in a room full of people, but you might as well be invisible? That's exactly where I found myself tonight, nursing a whiskey that tasted like disappointment at Dana's company dinner. The Hilton ballroom was all glitz and glamour, crystal chandeliers casting golden light over tables draped in white linen, waiters in bow ties weaving between conversations about quarterly reports and market projections. Everyone was dressed to impress, especially my wife Dana, who looked absolutely stunning in that emerald green dress that hugged her curves just right. She was in her element here, laughing with her colleagues, gesturing animatedly as she told some story about landing a big client. I watched her from across our table, feeling like a fish out of water among all these corporate sharks. These weren't my people. Hell, I wasn't even sure they were Dana's people, but she seemed to fit in seamlessly with their world of power suits and profit margins. Jordan. Travis's voice cut through my thoughts like nails on a chalkboard. Travis Miller, Dana's coworker and the biggest pain in my ass at these events. The guy was all teeth and hair gel, the kind of dude who probably practiced his smile in the mirror every morning. He was holding his champagne glass high, swaying slightly from whatever he'd been drinking before dinner. Come on over here, buddy. I forced a smile and walked over to where he was standing with a small crowd of Dana's colleagues. Arthur Granger, the CEO, was there looking distinguished in his expensive suit, along with a few other executives whose names I'd forgotten about 5 minutes after being introduced. Dana appeared at my side, slipping her arm through mine with that practiced corporate wife smile she'd perfected over the years. So, Jordan, Travis continued, his voice getting louder as more people turned to listen. What's it like being married to our rising star here? He gestured toward Dana with his glass, spilling a little champagne on the white tablecloth. Must be nice having a sugar mama, huh? A few people chuckled, but I kept my expression neutral. This wasn't the first time Travis had taken shots at me, and it probably wouldn't be the last. The guy had some weird complex about successful women, especially when their husbands weren't climbing the corporate ladder right beside them. I mean, seriously though, Travis pressed on, clearly enjoying himself now that he had an audience. What do you even do all day while Dana's out here crushing it in the business world? Play video games. Watch Netflix. More laughter rippled through the group. I felt Dana's grip tighten on my arm, but when I glanced at her, she wasn't looking at me with concern or anger on my behalf. She was smiling that same practice smile, like this was all just harmless fun between friends. Travis, Arthur interjected with a diplomatic chuckle, maybe we should. No, it's fine. Travis waved him off, his voice rising even higher. I'm genuinely curious. I mean, Jordan seems like a nice enough guy, but let's be real here. He turned to face me directly, his eyes glassy from the alcohol. What's it like being a loser? Must be strange having your wife pay all the bills, right? The words hit me like a slap across the face. The entire table went quiet for a heartbeat, then erupted in laughter. Even some people from neighboring tables turned to see what was so funny. And there, right next to me, was Dana, laughing along with the rest of them. Not uncomfortably, not apologetically, but genuinely amused by her colleague's assessment of her husband. Something cold settled in my chest as I watched her laugh. After 15 years of marriage, after everything we'd been through together, she was laughing at me being called a loser. In front of all these people who barely knew me, who had no idea what I'd sacrificed or what I'd built before I decided to step back from the spotlight. I stood there for a moment, letting the laughter wash over me, feeling smaller and smaller with each passing second. Then something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the whiskey, maybe it was years of biting my tongue at these events, or maybe I was just tired of being treated like Dana's accessory instead of her equal. I smiled, not the forced smile I'd been wearing all evening, but a genuine one that probably looked a little scary given the circumstances. The laughter started to die down as people noticed my expression. You know what, Travis? I said, my voice calm and steady. You're absolutely right. It must seem pretty strange from where you're sitting. I turned to Arthur Granger, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable as he sensed the shift in the room's energy. Arthur, I continued, still smiling that same unsettling smile. How does it feel to know that this loser owns 90% of your company? The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop in that massive ballroom. Arthur's face went white as a sheet, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. Dana's arm fell away from mine as she stared at me with her mouth slightly open, confusion and disbelief written all over her face. Travis, meanwhile, looked like someone had just told him Santa Claus wasn't real. His stupid grin melted away as he tried to process what I'd just said. What? Dana whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden tension. I looked around the table at all these people who had been laughing just seconds ago, enjoying my humiliation, treating me like some kind of joke. Now they were all staring at me like I'd just revealed I was an alien from another planet. Did I stutter? I asked, my voice still perfectly calm. Orion Systems. Remember that little tech startup that merged with Nextra 5 years ago? The one that basically saved this company from bankruptcy. I paused, watching realization dawn on Arthur's face. Yeah, that was mine. Still is, actually. Dana's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, red wine spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over the room, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. Whispered conversations, urgent questions, the scraping of chairs as people leaned in to hear better. But I was done. I'd said what I needed to say. I straightened my tie, took one last look at my wife's stunned face, and walked away from the table. As I headed toward the exit, I could hear the chaos erupting behind me. Arthur's panicked voice trying to restore order, Dana calling my name, Travis demanding to know if what I'd said was true. Just like that, the game had changed. After years of playing the quiet husband, the supportive spouse who stayed in the background while his wife shined, I'd finally reminded them all of something they'd apparently forgotten. You should never underestimate the person you're laughing at. They might just own everything you think you know. The hotel's marble floors echoed with each step I took toward the exit, but I could feel their eyes burning into my back like lasers. Every conversation in that ballroom had stopped dead, and I knew without looking that dozens of corporate vultures were craning their necks to watch the quiet husband make his dramatic exit. Good. Let them stare. Let them wonder how badly they'd screwed up by underestimating the guy they'd been treating like Dana's pet dog for the past 5 years. I was almost to the revolving doors when I heard the rapid click-clack of heels on marble behind me. Jordan, wait. Dana's voice was sharp with panic, cutting through the ambient noise of the hotel lobby. I didn't slow down. If anything, I picked up the pace, my hands shoved deep in my pockets as I navigated through clusters of tourists and business travelers. Jordan, damn it, stop. The desperation in her voice was something I hadn't heard in years, not since her dad had his heart attack, and she thought she might lose him. But I kept walking. She wanted to chase me? Fine. She could chase me all the way to the parking garage if she felt like it. I heard her stumble slightly. Those designer heels weren't made for speed. And then she was right behind me, breathing hard. What the hell do you mean you own the company? She demanded, grabbing my arm and trying to spin me around to face her. I stopped walking but didn't turn around immediately. Instead, I stood there for a moment, listening to her ragged breathing, feeling the weight of her manicured fingers digging into my jacket sleeve. When I finally faced her, she looked like she'd seen a ghost. Her perfectly applied makeup was starting to smudge around her eyes, and that emerald dress that had looked so stunning an hour ago was now wrinkled from her sprint across the hotel. You really don't know, do you? I asked, studying her face carefully. The confusion there seemed genuine, but then again, Dana had always been good at playing whatever role the situation required. You honestly have no clue who you married. Don't be cryptic with me right now, she snapped, her corporate executive voice kicking in. Explain to me how you can possibly own 90% of Nexera when you've been unemployed for the past 3 years. Unemployed. The word hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I'd heard her use it before when talking to her friends. Never to my face, of course, but I'd overheard enough phone conversations to know how she really saw our arrangement. Her successful career, my retirement, that she apparently viewed as extended unemployment. That's what you think I've been doing. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sitting around unemployed while you bring home the bacon? Well, What else would you call it? She shot back, her voice rising. A few people walking past us turned to stare, but Dana was too worked up to care about making a scene. You haven't had a real job since you sold that little software company back in. That little software company, I interrupted, was Orion Systems. And I didn't just sell it, Dana. I merged it with a failing tech firm called Nexra Corporation. Ring any bells? The color drained from her face as the pieces started clicking together in her mind. I could practically see the gears turning as she remembered conversations from years ago, back when she was just a junior analyst and I was still actively involved in the business world. That's impossible, she whispered, but I could tell she was starting to remember. Orion Systems that was a major player. The merger saved Nexra from bankruptcy. It was worth millions. Try hundreds of millions, I corrected. And it wasn't worth that much. It is worth that much. Present tense, Dana. Because I never sold my shares. I just stepped back from day-to-day operations and let Arthur run the show while I focused on other things. Other things like what? She demanded. But her voice had lost its edge. Now she just sounded confused and maybe a little scared. Like being your husband, I said simply. Like cooking dinner every night while you worked late. Like handling the mortgage payments and the car insurance and all those boring financial details you never wanted to deal with. Like supporting your career while everyone assumed I was some kind of deadbeat. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the reality standing in front of her. All those times she'd introduced me as someone who used to work in tech. All those dinner parties where she'd made jokes about me being retired at 45. All those corporate events where colleagues like Travis felt comfortable mocking me because she'd never bothered to set the record straight. Why didn't you ever say anything? She asked finally. Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I own, I replied. I wanted to know that if I lost everything tomorrow, you'd still want to be married to me. But the moment people thought I had nothing, they treated me like I was nothing, including you. The truth of that statement hung in the air between us like smoke. She opened her mouth to protest, but we both knew it was true. She'd laughed tonight. When Travis called me a loser, when he mocked me for being supported by my wife, when he basically called me a worthless piece of trash in front of a room full of people, she'd laughed right along with everyone else. I didn't know, she said weakly. You didn't want to know, I corrected. Every time someone made a crack about me being unemployed or living off your success, you just smiled and let it slide. You never once stood up for me or told them they had no idea what they were talking about. But Jordan, I really didn't. They'd all forgotten who I was. I interrupted, my voice getting harder. But I never forgot. I never forgot that Arthur Granger came to me 15 years ago, hat in hand, begging me to save his company from bankruptcy. I never forgot signing those merger documents that made me the majority shareholder of the new corporation. I never forgot that every paycheck you've ever gotten from Nexra was technically coming from me. Her legs seemed to give out a little, and she grabbed onto a nearby pillar for support. This is insane. You're telling me that all this time, while I've been working my way up the corporate ladder, fighting for promotions and respect, you've been working for your husband, I finished. Yeah, ironic, isn't it? I could see the implications hitting her like a freight train. Every meeting she'd attended, every decision she'd helped make, every time she'd felt proud of her independence and success, all of it had been under the umbrella of a company I controlled. Her colleagues, her career, her entire professional identity was built on a foundation I'd laid years before she even knew my name. So what happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at her standing there in that expensive dress, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, to go back to the way things were. But a bigger part of me, the part that had been humiliated and dismissed and laughed at, wasn't ready to forgive and forget. Now, I said, straightening my tie, now I stop being the invisible man. I stop letting people think I'm some kind of joke. And maybe, just maybe, I remind everyone at Nexra exactly who's been signing their paychecks all these years. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving my wife standing alone in the hotel lobby, finally understanding that the man she'd married wasn't who she thought he was at all. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and racing thoughts. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white, and I kept replaying Dana's shocked expression over and over in my mind. The way her face had crumpled when the reality hit her. The way she grabbed that pillar like her whole world was falling apart. Which, honestly, it probably was. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the adrenaline from the confrontation was starting to wear off, replaced by something colder and more focused. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at our house. The house I'd bought with Orion money, though Dana had always assumed it came from some mysterious inheritance I'd mentioned years ago. Another lie of omission in a marriage apparently built on them. I walked through the front door and headed straight for my home office, the one room in the house that Dana rarely entered. She called it my man cave, which always made me cringe, but I'd never bothered to correct her. Let her think I spent my days in here playing fantasy football and watching YouTube videos. The truth was so much more interesting. My office looked ordinary enough from the outside. Desk, computer, a few framed photos, some bookshelves lined with tech manuals and business journals. But the real treasure was hidden behind a false panel I'd had installed in the built-in bookshelf. I pressed the hidden latch, and the panel swung open to reveal a fireproof safe that contained the most important documents of my life. I pulled out the thick manila folder labeled Nexera Holdings and spread its contents across my desk like a card player revealing a royal flush. Every piece of paper told the same story, but seeing them all together again after so many years still gave me a rush. These weren't just contracts and agreements. They were proof that Jordan Rivers, the guy everyone thought was living off his wife's success, was actually the puppet master pulling all the strings. The original merger documents were yellowed around the edges now, but Arthur Granger's signature was still bold and black at the bottom of every page. I remembered that day 15 years ago when he'd sat in this very office, sweating through his expensive suit as he begged me to save his failing company. Back then, Nexera was hemorrhaging money, losing clients left and right, and about 6 months away from total collapse. Arthur had heard through the grapevine that I was looking to expand Orion Systems, and he'd come crawling to me with an offer that was basically corporate surrender. "Just name your terms," he'd said, his voice shaking slightly. "We need this merger to work, or we're finished." I'd been generous, maybe too generous. Instead of crushing Nexera completely and absorbing their assets, I'd structured the deal to keep their brand alive while giving me controlling interest. 90% ownership, to be exact, with full voting rights and veto power over any major decisions. Arthur kept his CEO title and a nice salary, and his employees kept their jobs. Everyone won, especially me. But the real genius of the arrangement was the blind trust I'd insisted on. All my shares would be held by a private investment firm, with my identity protected from public disclosure. As far as most people knew, Nexera had been saved by some mysterious corporate investor who preferred to remain anonymous. Only Arthur and a handful of lawyers knew the truth, and they were all bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements. I picked up the trust documents and scanned through the legalese until I found the clause I was looking for. There it was, in black and white. The beneficial owner retains the right to assume direct control of all holdings upon written notice to the trustee and board of directors. In plain English, I could step out from behind the curtain any time I wanted and take control of the company. The question was, did I want to? For the past 5 years, I'd been perfectly content to let Arthur run the day-to-day operations while I collected my dividends and enjoyed my quiet retirement. The money had always been more than enough. Hell, Dana's salary was basically pocket change compared to what Nexera was generating. I'd never needed the spotlight or the corporate power games. I'd been there, done that, and decided I preferred a simpler life. But tonight had changed something fundamental. Tonight, I'd been publicly humiliated by people who owed their livelihoods to my generosity. Travis Miller, that smug bastard, had called me a loser while cashing checks from a company I owned. Dana had laughed at jokes about her unemployed husband while building her career on the foundation I'd provided. Even Arthur, who knew damn well who I was, had just stood there and let it happen. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Marcus Trent's number. Marcus had been my lawyer since the early days of Orion Systems, and he was one of the few people who knew all my secrets. It was almost midnight, but Marcus was a night owl who often worked late on complex corporate deals. He answered on the second ring. "Jordan, this is late, even for you. Everything okay? I need you to prepare some documents," I said, getting straight to the point. I want to request a full financial audit of Nexra's executive compensation packages, corporate credit card usage, and any potential conflicts of interest among the leadership team. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jordan, what's going on? You haven't shown any interest in Nexra's operations for years. Let's just say I've had a wake-up call, I replied. Also, I want to schedule a meeting with the board of directors. It's time they met their largest shareholder face-to-face. Are you sure about this? Once you step out from behind the blind trust, there's no going back. Your anonymity will be gone forever. I looked around my office at all the evidence of my hidden empire. Financial statements showing profits that would make Dana's head spin. Email correspondence with CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who still considered me a major player in the tech world. Stock portfolios that had been quietly growing for years while everyone assumed I was some kind of house husband. Marcus, I said, I've been invisible for too long. It's time to remind people who they're dealing with. All right, he said, and I could hear him already reaching for his legal pad. I'll have the audit request ready by morning, and I'll reach out to the board to schedule an emergency meeting. But Jordan, whatever happened tonight, just make sure you're doing this for the right reasons. Don't worry about my reasons, I said. Just worry about making sure everything is bulletproof legally. Because if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and stared at the documents spread across my desk. Tomorrow, the corporate world that had forgotten about Jordan Rivers was about to get a very rude awakening. And Dana? She was about to learn that the man she'd been taking for granted was actually the most powerful person in her professional life. I carefully placed all the documents back in the safe and locked it away. But this time, I knew it wouldn't be long before I'd need them again. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Dana's heels clicking around upstairs, her usual pre-work routine in full swing. Coffee brewing, news playing on the kitchen TV, the familiar symphony of a corporate executive getting ready to conquer another day. Except today wasn't going to be like any other day, and she had no clue what was coming. I stayed in bed for a few extra minutes, listening to her move around the house. Through the thin walls, I could hear her talking on the phone, probably to her assistant, going over her schedule, discussing client meetings and quarterly reports. The same conversations she'd been having for years, blissfully unaware that every decision she made at work ultimately flowed through me. When I finally made it to the kitchen, she was standing by the counter in her navy blue power suit, scrolling through emails on her phone while sipping coffee from her favorite mug, the one that said Boss Lady in gold letters. I'd bought it for her as a joke on her birthday last year, but she'd actually started using it unironically. Morning, she said without looking up from her phone. Her voice was carefully neutral, like she was trying to pretend last night's bombshell revelation had been some kind of weird dream. Morning, I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee and leaning against the counter. Sleep well. She finally glanced at me, and I could see the confusion and worry still swimming in her eyes. Jordan, about last night. Don't. I cut her off gently. We don't need to make this into some big dramatic thing. You were just having fun with your coworkers. I get it. The relief that washed over her face was almost painful to watch. She actually thought I was going to let it slide, go back to being the quiet husband who smiled and nodded while her colleagues treated me like furniture. They were just joking around, she said, the words coming out in a rush. You know how Travis gets when he's been drinking. He doesn't mean anything by it. Of course not, I agreed, taking a sip of my coffee. He was just being Travis. No harm, no foul, right? Exactly. She looked so relieved she might have hugged me if she wasn't worried about wrinkling her suit. I'm glad you're not going to make a big deal out of it. I mean, we both know you're not actually. You know, unemployed or whatever. You've got your investments and your consulting work. Right? I nodded. My little side projects. She kissed me on the cheek before heading toward the garage, her heels clicking with renewed confidence. I'll probably be late tonight. We're working on the Morrison account, and you know how demanding those clients can be. I won't wait up, I said. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and started typing. The first email was to Arthur Granger, short and sweet. Arthur, I need to discuss some concerns about Nexra's corporate culture and leadership practices. Please provide a full breakdown of executive compensation packages, expense accounts, and any potential conflicts of interest among senior staff. I'd like this information by end of business today. Thanks, Jordan Rivers. I read it over twice before hitting send. Arthur would probably have a heart attack when he saw my name in his inbox, especially after last night's little scene. He'd spent 5 years hoping I'd stay in the shadows forever, and now I was asking for detailed financial records like some kind of activist investor. My phone was ringing before I'd even finished my second cup of coffee. Marcus Trent here, came the familiar voice of my lawyer. I've been up all night working on those documents you requested. Are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this? More sure than I've been about anything in years, I replied. What V you got for me? Well, the audit request is ironclad. As majority shareholder, you have every right to examine the company's financial practices. I've also drafted a formal notice to the board requesting an emergency meeting. But Jordan, once I send these documents, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. Everyone's going to know who you are. Good, I said. I'm tired of being anonymous. There's something else, Marcus continued, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. I did some preliminary research on Nexra's recent activities, and there are some red flags. That Travis Miller you mentioned? He's been steering contracts toward a construction company owned by his cousin. Nothing technically illegal, but definitely ethically questionable. Interesting, I said, though I wasn't really surprised. Guys like Travis always had some kind of angle, some way to game the system for personal benefit. There's more. Several executives have been using corporate credit cards for personal expenses, fancy dinners, golf trips, even some questionable client entertainment that looks more like family vacations. Arthur's been pretty loose with oversight. I felt a cold smile spreading across my face. Arthur had gotten comfortable, maybe too comfortable. He'd probably figured that his mysterious investor would never bother to look under the hood, never question how the company was being run as long as the profits kept flowing. Send everything, I told Marcus. The audit request, the board meeting notice, all of it. It's time to shake things up. You got it. But Jordan, just remember, you're about to go from being the man behind the curtain to center stage. That's a big change, and it's going to affect more than just your professional life. After hanging up with Marcus, I spent the rest of the morning researching Nexra's current operations. What I found wasn't pretty. Arthur had let standards slide, allowed a toxic culture to develop, and turned a blind eye to questionable practices as long as the bottom line looked good. The company I'd saved 15 years ago had become exactly the kind of corporate cesspool I'd always despised. By noon, I was ready to make my move. I opened my laptop and started typing another email, this one to Margaret Wu, Nexra's VP of Engineering. Margaret was one of the few people at that company who I actually respected, brilliant, hardworking, and completely overlooked by the boys' club that ran the executive floor. Margaret, I wrote, you don't know me personally, but I've been following your work at Nexra for some time. I think you're exactly the kind of leader the company needs. We should talk soon. Best regards, Jordan Rivers. I was about to send it when my phone buzzed with a text from Dana. Everything okay at home? Arthur seems really stressed about something. Says he got some weird email this morning. I typed back. Everything's fine. Tell Arthur not to worry. I'm sure whatever it is will work itself out. But even as I sent the message, I knew that nothing was going to work itself out. In fact, things were about to get a whole lot more complicated for everyone at Nexra, starting with my wife. I hit send on the email to Margaret, then sat back in my chair and waited for the chaos to begin. For the first time in years, I wasn't the quiet investor sitting on the sidelines. I was back in the game, and I intended to win. The corporate rumor mill works faster than a Vegas poker dealer, and by 10 a.m., the first domino had already fallen. I was sitting in my home office, monitoring the situation through a network of contacts I'd maintained over the years, when my phone started buzzing with updates from Marcus. Travis Miller just got called into HR, he texted. Official reason: review of recent conduct at corporate events. Unofficial reason: your audit request lit a fire under Arthur's ass. I leaned back in my chair and smiled. Travis had probably strutted into that HR meeting thinking he was untouchable, the golden boy who could crack jokes about losers and unemployed husbands without consequences. He was about to learn that actions have a funny way of catching up with you, especially when the person you're mocking owns the company you work for. My laptop chimed with an incoming email from Arthur. The subject line read, urgent, need to discuss, and I could practically feel his panic radiating through the screen. I opened it and wasn't disappointed. Jordan, I received your request this morning, and I want to assure you that Nexera maintains the highest standards of corporate governance. Perhaps we could schedule a call to discuss your concerns in a more informal setting? I'm sure we can clear up any misunderstandings. Best regards, Arthur. Misunderstandings. That was rich. The only misunderstanding here was Arthur thinking he could keep playing fast and loose with my company while I stayed safely tucked away in retirement. I typed back a simple response. Arthur, I'm not interested in informal discussions. I want the documentation I requested by 5 p.m. today, and I want that board meeting scheduled for this week. No exceptions. While I was dealing with Arthur's damage control attempts, the real chaos was unfolding at Nexera's downtown headquarters. Marcus had a contact in the building, a paralegal who worked for the company's legal department, and she was feeding us intel like some kind of corporate spy thriller. Security just escorted Travis out of the building. Came the next update. Word is they found evidence of the cousin's construction contracts in his emails. He's been suspended pending a full investigation. I had to hand it to Arthur. When he moved fast. Travis had gone from company golden boy to corporate pariah in the span of a single morning. But then again, Arthur was probably scared shitless about what other skeletons might come tumbling out of the closet once I started digging deeper. My phone rang, and Dana's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message. Jordan, what the hell is happening over here? Travis got fired, people are freaking out about some audit, and Arthur looks like he's about to have a nervous breakdown. Call me back. Instead of calling her back, I texted. Sounds like a typical Tuesday at the office. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. But it wasn't nothing, and we both knew it. The machine I'd set in motion this morning was just getting started, and poor Dana was caught right in the middle without even realizing it. She thought she was dealing with some random corporate crisis, when in reality, she was watching her husband dismantle the toxic culture that had allowed people like Travis to flourish. Around noon, Marcus called with an update that made my day. The board meeting is scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. Arthur tried to push it to next week, but the other board members want answers about this sudden audit request. They're curious about who's been pulling the strings behind the scenes all these years. Perfect, I said. What about the financial records? Arthur's assistant just sent over a preliminary report. You're going to love this. Travis wasn't the only one with his hand in the cookie jar. Looks like there's been a whole pattern of questionable expenses and ethical violations among the executive team. I felt that familiar rush of satisfaction that came from being proven right. These people had gotten comfortable, maybe too comfortable, thinking that their mysterious benefactor would never bother to check up on them. They'd treated my investment like free money, my generosity like weakness. By 3 p.m., the gossip network was in full swing. Dana texted me updates throughout the afternoon, each message more frantic than the last. They just suspended 2 more executives. Someone said there's going to be a major restructuring. The whole leadership team is in panic mode. And then, around 4 p.m., came the message that told me everything I needed to know about where Dana's loyalties really lay. Jordan, please tell me you're not behind this somehow. People are losing their jobs, and I can't afford to get caught in the crossfire. My career is everything to me. Her career. Not our marriage, not our future together, but her precious career that she'd built on the foundation I provided. She was more worried about protecting her professional reputation than understanding why her husband might have finally decided to stand up for himself. I didn't respond to that text. Instead, I called Marcus and told him to expedite everything. I want that board meeting moved to tomorrow if possible. Strike while the iron's hot. Jordan, are you sure you don't want to ease into this? You could make your presence known gradually. Maybe start with a private meeting with Arthur. No, I cut him off. I've been easing into things for 15 years. It's time to remind everyone who's really in charge here. By 5 p.m., Arthur had delivered the financial documentation I'd requested, and it was even worse than I'd expected. Executive bonuses that bordered on obscene, corporate retreats that looked more like luxury vacations, and a pattern of nepotism and favoritism that would make a mob boss blush. These people had been treating Nexera like their personal piggy bank, while I sat quietly in the background, content to let them play with my money. But the quiet Jordan Rivers was gone. The guy who smiled and nodded while his wife's colleagues mocked him was officially retired. Tomorrow, I was going to walk into that boardroom and remind everyone exactly who owned this company. And if Dana didn't like it? Well, she'd had 15 years to figure out who she was really married to. If she was more concerned about her career than her husband, maybe it was time for both of us to reevaluate our priorities. The game had changed, all right, and I was just getting started. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharper, more focused. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the tie on a suit I hadn't worn in 3 years. Charcoal gray Armani. Perfectly tailored, the kind of power suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Dana had already left for work early, claiming she had damage control meetings to attend before the mysterious board meeting that had everyone at Nextera walking on eggshells. The irony wasn't lost on me. My own wife was trying to protect herself from the fallout of my decisions, completely unaware that she was married to the eye of the storm. The drive to Nextera's headquarters felt like traveling back in time. I'd been to this building countless times over the years, but always as Dana's quiet husband, the guy who occasionally showed up to holiday parties and company picnics. Today, I was walking through those glass doors as Jordan Rivers, majority shareholder and the man who'd been pulling the strings from behind the curtain for 15 years. Marcus met me in the parking garage, looking sharp in his usual Navy suit and carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than some people's cars. "You ready for this?" he asked, studying my face carefully. "I've been ready for 15 years, I replied. I just didn't know it until now. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent except for the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. I watched the numbers climb, 10, 15, 20, and felt something shift inside me with each floor. By the time we reached the boardroom level, the Jordan Rivers who'd been content to stay in the shadows was gone, replaced by someone who was ready to reclaim what had always been his. Arthur was waiting outside the boardroom, pacing like a caged animal. When he saw me step off the elevator, his face went white as fresh snow. "Jordan," he said, extending his hand with forced enthusiasm. "It's been too long. You look, well." "Arthur," I replied, shaking his hand and noticing how clammy his palm was. "I bet you never thought you'd see me in this building again." "Well, you know, you're always welcome here. This is you're obviously a valued." He was stumbling over his words like a nervous teenager, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the building's air conditioning. "My company," I finished for him. "You can say it, Arthur. This is my company." Before he could respond, the boardroom doors opened, and I got my first look at the people who'd been making decisions about my investment for the past decade and a half. 5 board members, all looking confused and slightly annoyed about being called to an emergency meeting. They probably thought this was about some minor crisis that Arthur could handle with his usual corporate double talk. They were about to learn how wrong they were. "Gentlemen," Arthur announced as we entered the room, "I'd like you to meet Jordan Rivers." The silence that followed was beautiful. You could practically see the mental gymnastics happening as they tried to place the name. Jordan Rivers, or had they heard that before? Then, one by one, recognition dawned on their faces like sunrise breaking over a mountain range. "Wait," said Patricia Hensley, the only woman on the board. "Jordan Rivers as in, the Orion Systems Jordan Rivers?" "The very same," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table like I owned the place. Which of course I did. Nice to finally meet you all in person. The next few minutes were a masterclass in corporate panic. Board members frantically shuffling through papers, whispered conversations, confused glances exchanged across the mahogany table. Arthur looked like he wanted to crawl under the conference table and disappear. "I think there's been some confusion," said Robert Chun, the board's treasurer. "Our records show that Orion Systems was acquired through a blind trust arrangement. The beneficial owner's identity has always been confidential." "Not confidential," I corrected. "Just private. There's a difference. Arthur here has known exactly who I am from day one. Haven't you, Arthur?" Arthur cleared his throat and nodded reluctantly. "Yes. Well, Mr. Rivers preferred to maintain his anonymity while the company established its new direction after the merger." 15 years is a long time to establish direction," I said, opening the briefcase Marcus had prepared. "Long enough for some people to forget that actions have consequences." I spread the financial documents across the table like a dealer laying out cards. Executive compensation reports, expense account summaries, the evidence of Travis's nepotistic dealings, and a whole lot more that painted a picture of a company that had lost its way. This is what I've been paying for. I continued, my voice calm, but carrying an edge that made everyone sit up straighter. Executives using corporate credit cards for family vacations, hiring practices that favor friends and relatives over qualified candidates, and a company culture that thinks it's acceptable to mock and belittle people without consequences. Patricia leaned forward, studying the documents. These are serious allegations, Mr. Rivers. If even half of this is accurate, it's all accurate, I assured her. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. You see, when you think the boss is never watching, you tend to get sloppy. You start treating the company like your personal playground instead of a business. Arthur was sweating openly now. Jordan, if there have been some irregularities, I'm sure we can address them through proper channels. The proper channel, I interrupted, is me standing up and taking control of the company I've owned all along. Which brings me to why we're all here today. I pulled out one final document. A formal notice of intent that Marcus had drafted the night before. Effective immediately, I'm exercising my right as majority shareholder to assume direct operational oversight of Nexra Corporation. Arthur, I appreciate your service over the years, but your resignation will be accepted immediately. The room erupted in a chorus of shocked voices, but I held up my hand for silence. I'm not finished. Travis Miller's termination will stand, obviously, but there are going to be other changes as well, starting with a complete overhaul of our executive team and our corporate culture. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Somewhere down there, Dana was probably sitting in her office, completely unaware that her husband had just fired her boss and taken control of the company she'd spent years climbing the ladder at. You see, I said, turning back to face the room. I've spent 15 years watching this company from the shadows. I've seen how you treat people when you think no one important is watching. I've seen how you operate when you think the money will keep flowing no matter what you do. I walked back to my chair, but remained standing. Well, someone important was always watching. And the money keeps flowing because I allow it to flow. But that arrangement is about to change dramatically. Arthur slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. What happens now? Now, I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Now we rebuild this place from the ground up. With respect, integrity, and accountability. You know, all those corporate buzzwords you've been throwing around in annual reports while doing the exact opposite. I gathered up my documents and stood to leave. Oh, and Arthur? Clear out your office by the end of the day. Security will escort you out when you're finished. As I walked toward the door, I could hear the chaos erupting behind me. Frantic phone calls, heated discussions, the sound of a corporate house of cards collapsing. But for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. The quiet Jordan Rivers was officially dead. Long live the king. The emergency board vote took place at exactly 6:47 p.m., and it was the most satisfying 17 minutes of my professional life. I sat at the head of that mahogany table watching 5 board members who'd probably never questioned a decision in their lives suddenly scramble to distance themselves from Arthur's administration. All in favor of accepting Arthur Granger's resignation, effective immediately? I asked, even though we all knew it wasn't really a resignation when you're escorted out by security. 5 hands shot up without hesitation. Even Patricia Hensley, who'd worked with Arthur for over a decade, voted to cut him loose. Corporate loyalty was a beautiful thing until it threatened your own position. Motion carries, I announced. Now, let's talk about restructuring. The next item on my agenda was Travis Miller's permanent termination, which passed unanimously. Apparently, nobody wanted to defend the guy who'd been steering contracts to his cousin's construction company while insulting the actual owner of the firm. Funny how quickly people's perspectives changed when they realized who was really signing the checks. But the real bombshell came when I announced my choice for Arthur's replacement. I'm nominating Margaret Wu for the position of Chief Executive Officer. The silence in that room was deafening. Robertson looked like I'd just suggested we hire a circus clown to run the company. Margaret Wu from engineering? He asked. She's never held an executive position. She's never held an executive position because this company has spent 15 years promoting people based on who they play golf with instead of who actually gets results, I replied. Margaret has been running successful projects while your previous leadership team was busy padding their expense accounts. I'd done my homework on Margaret over the years. While guys like Travis were schmoozing clients at expensive steakhouses, she was in the trenches solving problems and delivering solutions. While Arthur was giving speeches about innovation, Margaret was actually innovating. She was exactly the kind of leader Nexera needed, and exactly the kind of person the old boys club had been overlooking. With all due respect, Mr. Rivers, Patricia interjected, promoting someone from engineering to CEO is a significant leap. Perhaps we should consider external candidates. With all due respect, Patricia, I cut her off. I own this company. Margaret Wu gets the job. Another vote, another unanimous result. Amazing how agreeable people became when their paychecks were on the line. By 7:30, Margaret was sitting in the boardroom, looking like someone had just told her she'd won the lottery. Which, in a way, she had. I'd called her up from engineering 20 minutes earlier with a simple message. Margaret, I need you in the boardroom. Now. She'd arrived still wearing her work clothes, khakis, and a Nexera polo shirt, looking completely out of place among the suits and ties. But when I explained what was happening, when I told her she was about to become the CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation, something incredible happened. Her eyes lit up with the kind of fire I hadn't seen in corporate leadership for years. I want you to run this place with respect, I told her as the board members filed out, already making phone calls and planning damage control strategies. Respect for employees, respect for clients, and respect for the fact that this company exists to solve problems, not line pockets. Margaret nodded, tears forming in her eyes. Mr. Rivers, I don't know what to say. I've been watching this place operate for 10 years, seeing all the waste in politics, wishing someone would actually care about doing good work instead of just looking good on paper. Well, now you're in charge of fixing it, I said. Full operational control, my complete backing, and a mandate to clean house however you see fit. As I stood to leave, I noticed Dana standing in the hallway outside the boardroom, her face pale as moonlight. She'd obviously heard about the emergency meeting, probably gotten updates throughout the evening about Arthur's firing and the complete restructuring of her company's leadership. But for the first time since this whole thing started, she wasn't looking at me with confusion or anger. She was looking at me with something that might have been respect. Or maybe it was fear. At this point, I wasn't sure there was much difference. Margaret, I said, turning back to our new CEO, your first order of business is to review every employee's performance based on merit, not politics. I want the good people promoted and the deadweight removed. This company is about to remember what it means to earn success instead of inheriting it. I walked past Dana without a word, leaving her standing there as the reality finally sank in. Her quiet husband hadn't just owned the company all along. He'd just completely transformed it in a single evening. I made it exactly 3 steps through our front door before Dana exploded like a shaken champagne bottle. She'd beaten me home by 20 minutes. Probably breaking every speed limit between downtown and our subdivision, and she was pacing around our living room like a caged tiger when I walked in. You embarrassed me, she screamed, whirling around to face me with mascara streaked down her cheeks. Do you have any idea what you've done? Everyone at work is talking about how I didn't even know who my own husband was. They think I'm either the world's worst wife or a complete idiot. I loosened my tie and hung my jacket on the back of a chair, taking my time while she worked herself into a full-blown meltdown. Which one are you more worried about? I asked calmly. Don't you dare turn this around on me. Her voice cracked with emotion. I've spent years building my reputation at that company, years proving myself, and you just destroyed it all in one night. Margaret Wu is my boss now, Margaret from engineering. Do you know how humiliating that is? About as humiliating as having your coworkers call your husband a loser while you laugh along. I suggested, sitting down on the couch and watching her pace back and forth across our hardwood floors. She stopped mid-stride, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. That's not. I didn't. It was just harmless office banter. Harmless, I repeated. Right. Travis calling me unemployed was harmless. Him asking what it's like to be a loser was harmless. You laughing when he said it must be strange having your wife pay the bills. That was all just harmless fun. I laughed because it was awkward, she protested, throwing her hands up in the air. What was I supposed to do? Cause a scene at a company dinner? Make everyone uncomfortable? I leaned back against the couch cushions and really looked at my wife. This woman I'd been married to for 15 years, who was standing in our living room having a complete breakdown because her professional image had taken a hit. Not because she'd hurt me. Not because she'd realized how badly she'd misjudged the man she'd promised to love and honor, but because she was embarrassed. You were supposed to defend your husband, I said quietly. You were supposed to tell Travis to shut his mouth and show some respect. You were supposed to act like you actually knew who you married. But I didn't know, she wailed, and finally, the real truth came pouring out. I didn't know you still owned everything. You never said anything. You let me think you were just, retired, living off investments and consulting fees. You cooked dinner every night and fixed things around the house, and you thought I was a kept man? I finished. You thought you were the breadwinner supporting her unemployed husband. And that was fine with you as long as nobody said it out loud. She collapsed onto the opposite end of the couch, her designer suit wrinkled and her perfect hair falling out of its pins. That's not fair. I never thought of you that way. Dana, you introduced me as someone who used to work in tech at every single company event for the past 3 years. You bought me a coffee mug that says, "World's okayest husband" for my birthday. You told your mother I was having a midlife crisis when I bought that motorcycle. Those were just jokes. No, I said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked our backyard. Those were signs of how you really saw me. And the moment Travis said out loud what you'd been thinking for years, you laughed because it was true. At least, you thought it was true. I could hear her crying behind me, soft hiccuping sobs that might have broken my heart a week ago. But right now, all I felt was tired. Tired of being misunderstood, tired of being underestimated, tired of being married to someone who was more concerned about her corporate reputation than her husband's dignity. I wanted you to love me even if I had nothing, I said, still looking out at the yard where I'd spent countless Saturday afternoons mowing grass while she worked late at the office. I wanted to know that if everything fell apart tomorrow, you'd still want to be married to me. But the moment people thought I had nothing, they treated me like I was nothing, including you. Jordan, please. You laughed when they insulted me, Dana. You sat there in that ballroom, wearing a dress I paid for, at a party celebrating a company I own, and you laughed when someone called your husband a loser. She was sobbing openly now, curled up on the couch like a broken doll. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I turned around to face her, and for the first time in our marriage, I didn't feel the urge to comfort her when she cried. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. What happens now? She whispered. I looked at this woman who'd shared my bed for 15 years, who'd built her entire professional identity without realizing it was all connected to me, who'd laughed at jokes about my failures while living off my success. Now you learn who you're really married to, I said, and I figure out if I still want to be married to you. The following weeks at Nexera felt like watching a phoenix rise from corporate ashes. I started showing up to the office regularly for the first time in years, not as Dana's quiet husband, but as Jordan Rivers, the guy who'd been pulling the strings all along. The transformation was incredible to witness. Margaret hit the ground running like she'd been born for this job. Within her first week, she'd implemented an open-door policy that actually meant something, started weekly all-hands meetings where employees could voice concerns without fear of retaliation, and began reviewing every single contract and vendor relationship with a fine-tooth comb. The toxic culture that had festered under Arthur's leadership started evaporating like morning fog. Mr. Rivers, she said during one of our daily check-ins, I've never seen morale improve this fast. People are actually excited to come to work again. She was right. Walking through the office floors, I could see the difference. Employees were collaborating instead of competing, sharing ideas instead of hoarding information. The cafeteria that had been dead silent for years was suddenly filled with conversation and laughter. Someone had even brought in a decent sound system, and soft jazz played in the background during lunch hours. Travis's lawsuit fizzled out exactly as Marcus had predicted. When faced with the mountain of evidence we'd compiled about his nepotistic schemes and contract manipulation, his lawyers advised him to settle quietly and disappear. He took a job with some mid-tier firm in Phoenix, probably telling everyone who'd listen about how he'd been railroaded by corporate politics. Meanwhile, Dana took a leave of absence. I need time to process everything, she told me one morning over coffee, her voice hollow and distant. I need to figure out who I am if I'm not climbing the corporate ladder at Nexera. I didn't argue with her decision. Honestly, it was probably for the best. Having her around the office would have been awkward for everyone involved. especially since half the employees knew she was married to the owner and the other half were still trying to figure out how they'd missed such a massive piece of information. But the real game changer was the foundation I established. The Jordan Rivers Foundation for Engineering Education, designed to provide scholarships and mentorship for underprivileged kids who wanted to pursue careers in technology. For years, I'd been writing checks to various charities, quiet donations that nobody knew about. Now I was putting my name and my story behind something that mattered. The first scholarship reception was held in Nexra's main conference room, the same space where I'd fired Arthur just months earlier. 25 kids from inner-city schools, their parents, teachers, and mentors, all gathered to celebrate possibilities. These weren't rich kids with connections and safety nets. These were hungry, brilliant young people who just needed someone to believe in them. I used to hide in the shadows, writing checks and staying anonymous. Now I showed up, shook hands, listened to stories, and showed these kids that respect and hard work could actually lead somewhere meaningful. The sweetest revenge wasn't punishment. It was building something better than what came before. 3 months later, I found myself back in the same Hilton ballroom where this whole journey had started, but everything was different now. The corporate awards night that Margaret had organized felt like stepping into an alternate universe, one where respect actually meant something and success was measured by impact rather than politics. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret announced from the podium, looking confident and radiant in her role as CEO. Please welcome Jordan Rivers, the man who believed in Nexra before anyone else did, and the visionary who's helping us build something truly meaningful. The applause that filled the room was genuine, warm, and completely different from the mocking laughter that had echoed in this same space just a few months ago. I stood up and walked to the front, passing tables full of employees who actually knew who I was now, who understood that the quiet guy they'd occasionally seen at company events was the reason they all had jobs. No more whispered jokes about Dana's unemployed husband. No more smirks about the loser who didn't contribute anything meaningful. These people had seen what I could build when I stopped hiding in the shadows. Dana sat quietly in the third row, wearing a simple black dress instead of her usual power suit. We were still married, technically, but everything between us had fundamentally shifted. She'd started therapy, began volunteering at the foundation, and was slowly learning to see me as something other than an accessory to her corporate ambitions. Maybe it was too late for us. Maybe it was just in time. That remained to be seen. Thank you, I said into the microphone, looking out at faces that reflected respect instead of ridicule. 3 months ago, some of you learned something that surprised you about the man standing here tonight. But the real surprise isn't that I owned this company all along. The real surprise is what we've built together since then. I gestured toward Margaret, who was beaming with pride. Under Margaret's leadership, Nexra has remembered what it means to actually solve problems instead of just talking about solving them. We've created an environment where good ideas matter more than good connections, where hard work gets recognized, and where respect isn't just a buzzword we throw around in mission statements. The foundation had funded its first class of scholarship recipients, 15 bright kids who were already showing incredible promise in their first semester of college. The mentorship program had paired Nexra employees with students from underprivileged backgrounds, creating bridges between dreams and opportunities. As I looked around that ballroom, I realized the sweetest revenge had never been about punishment at all. It was about building something better than what came before. It was about showing people that power used with purpose could transform everything it touched. The laughter had finally stopped, replaced by something infinitely more valuable, a legacy worth leaving behind.